Now, normal relations between allies, with France, with Japan, with Germany, with Turkey, important allies all, America has regular and often open disagreements. What makes America's relationship with Israel special is its uncritical nature, even when US interests are being hurt. What also makes the relationship special is the incredible largesse that the United States shows towards Israel. Over the past decade, $28.9 billion in economic aid, and on top of that, another $30 billion in military aid. That's almost $60 billion. Now, I ask you, to what end is this money being used? Ladies and gentlemen, we would submit that to ends often inimical to the American interest. Take the ongoing Israeli settlement program in the West Bank. At a cost of about $100 billion, this enterprise has grown the number of settlers in the West Bank from about 140,000 in 1996 to about 300,000 today. What's the result of this? Well, the result is an isolated, fragmented, atomized, fractured, humiliated Palestinian presence that simply makes a nonsense, a farce, of the notion of two states for two peoples. Yet two states for two peoples is the declared US objective. In effect, the United States is bankrolling the very Israeli policies that are dashing its own aims and the hopes of Oslo by making two states almost unimaginable. Does this make sense? Is that clever? I don't think so. Yes, I know Israel's a vibrant democracy isolated in the Middle East, and its values are closer to ours than those of closed Arab societies. But that does not mean that we should endorse Israel's systematic dismemberment of the two-state option. And if President Obama is serious about reaching out to the Muslim world, America must appear much more as an honest broker and less as Israel's spokesman.
Stuart Eisenstadt, who has been a senior American diplomat since the Carter administration, countered that the relationship with Israel is based on mutual values and strategic interests.
Unlike China or Russia or some of our European allies, our foreign policy since our founding fathers has never been devoid of morality. Indeed, morality is a central feature of our policy. As the first country to recognize Israel in 1947 after the Holocaust as a refuge for Jews, we would be betraying those principles were we to step back from the special relationship we've developed over 62 years. It would mean abandoning the only democratic, loyal, reliable ally in the region, which shares American values of democracy, rights for women, judicial independence, freedom of speech, and forming a 21st century culture. In addition, it's not just American values, it is American interests. Israel shares American interests in combating terrorism, in creating pro-Western, moderate Arab states in the region, in stopping nuclear proliferation, and in having peace with all of its neighbors. And indeed, let me point out that it is because of the special relationship with Israel that the Arab states know that the way in which Israel will make concessions is when it has a dependable American ally so that it can make those territorial concessions. And I've seen it happen at Camp David under President Carter. All of Sinai given back. I've seen it happen with Jordan and the peace agreement with Jordan. So it is a specious argument that we can only have good relations with the Muslim world if we abandon Israel. Indeed, they know we need to have that relationship to convince Israel to make those concessions.
Not so, says Rashid Khalidi, a Columbia University professor who was a Palestinian negotiator in the early 1990s. He says America's special relationship with Israel emboldens the Jewish state to stall in peace talks and hurts the U.S. image abroad.
I would be the last person as a Middle East historian to suggest that all the problems of the Middle East are caused by the U.S. special relationship with Israel. They're not. There are problems with Arab governments. There are problems among the Palestinians. There are problems inside Israel. But some problems are caused by this special relationship. Let me just list a couple of them. There are all kinds of things going on in public opinion in the Arab world. And one of the things that's going on is a deep distrust and unease with U.S. policy over this issue in particular. A second thing that has to be said is that there is a suspicion, in public opinion in particular, all over the Arab world, of the fact that the United States in the Middle East, because of this special relationship, is not and cannot be an honest broker. Everybody knows that the United States engages in prior coordination with Israel as a result of an agreement made by Secretary Kissinger back in the 70s, before anything starts between Arabs and Israelis. Everybody knows, in other words, that there's a big, fat U.S. thumb on the scales when the United States acts as a mediator. I recall in the negotiations in Washington, we were at an impasse with the Israeli side, and we were told, after much reluctance on the part of the State Department, that the United States would come with a bridging proposal. We were very pleased. They came with a bridging proposal that was worse than the position that the Israelis had offered us. This is what the special relationship gives you. It gives you a country that cannot act as an honest broker. The United States has to pull away from the special relationship with Israel if it is to play any kind of effective role in making peace. Now, this is particularly true because the hardest issues between the Palestinians and the Israelis, much harder than anything that had to be dealt with between Israel and Jordan or Israel and Egypt, have to do with issues that resonate all over the Arab world. Things like refugees, things like Jerusalem. These are not easy issues. If we stand with the stronger, as we have done consistently on these and other issues, if we stand with Israel and ignore the fact that these are not just things on which there's a claim on both sides, but most importantly, these are things that will negatively affect U.S. interests if we take a one-sided position. We are harming U.S. interests throughout the region.
But as a top Israeli diplomat over several decades, Itamar Rabinovich argues that in the relationship with Israel, the U.S. is always the senior partner, able to influence and sway Israeli policymakers, often against their own political instincts.
What does special relationship mean? It does not mean that the tail is walking the dog. It is a mutual relationship. I was an ambassador to Washington for nearly 4 years. I was a peace negotiator that worked very closely with the United States peace team. And I know how many disagreements we've had over the years with our American colleagues. How many times what we call pressure was brought to bear on Israeli decision makers. Even presidents who were considered very friendly. Bill Clinton, considered a great friend of Israel. He was a close friend of Yitzhak Rabin. He admired Rabin, but I've seen them argue fiercely. And I've seen Rabin yield to Clinton because he was the President of the United States, the senior partner in this special relationship. Now, what is special about the relationship? It's special, it's unique, because you have unusual loyalty on both sides. Much of what you heard from our opponents earlier this evening was actually in the frame of the Bush years. We're not in the Bush years anymore. For a year, there's been another administration in Washington. And actually, what we have seen was the President Obama who listened to such advice and began by taking some distance from Israel. He went to Cairo, he gave the speech to the Muslim world, he didn't go to Israel. What is the result? The result is the current impasse. It was a mistake to take even one step, because the voices that you heard from the Arab world was, you took one step, go all the way. That is the mistake. So the policy should be stay with the special relationship with Israel, and together with Israel, use it in order to make peace with the Middle East, including with the Palestinians.